So a couple of weeks ago, I brought a question to a lot of my students at Hillel. And the question was the following: how do you define an authentic Jewish practice? And of course, a question like that will evoke a multiplicity and a range of answers. But I brought a case study that was thought of by one of my colleagues. And the case study goes as follows. Every year in Israel, in the city of Tel Aviv, we know that on Yom Kippur, the entire city virtually shuts down. Restaurants aren't open, businesses are closed, and there's almost no traffic on the streets. And some streets are open to emergency vehicles, but there's actually other streets, major thoroughfares, and even freeways that sections of the freeway will actually be closed on Tel Aviv. So, of course, a budding tradition has grown in the last generation or two among Tel Aviv citizens that every Yom Kippur morning, they'll go out and they'll go for an annual Yom Kippur bike ride. And so the question and the case study that I brought to the students is biking on Yom Kippur in Tel Aviv an authentic Jewish experience? And of course, one can imagine the range of answers I got. One student saying, of course not. There's no Jewish text in the world that says, thou shalt bike on Yom Kippur. Another Jewish student answered, and they said, well, wait a minute. Who's to say who defines authentic Jewish practice? If that's what's happening bottom up, maybe that is just as valid of a Yom Kippur practice. And the conversation went on with other opinions, and it was a beautiful and important conversation. Towards the end, I wanted to throw a wrench into the whole conversation, and I wanted to challenge a lot of the students. And so I opened up YouTube and I YouTubed in Samaritan's Passover offering. Now, for those who are confused by what those words have to do with each other, the Samaritans, or the Shomronim, were a breakoff group from Judaism in the 6th century BCE. So a little bit of the Jewish historical background: when the Babylonian Empire came into ancient Israel, they destroyed the temple and they exiled the majority of Jews into Babylonia. But there was a group that actually stayed behind. They lived in the region of Samaria, otherwise known today as the northern part of the West Bank. And when Judaism went off into Babylonia, evolving and innovating and coming up with all these new tools to allow the practice of Judaism outside of a homeland, outside of a singular temple, the Samaritans continued on following their practice where they were following from the Torah. And this is fascinating ramifications today in the year 2021. The Samaritans, the Shomronim, in exactly a week from now, the day before Passover, will go and they will slaughter a Korban Pesach, a Passover offering. And the Samaritans will look in the Torah and they will follow these laws verbatim, word for word to a T. And every year on the eve of Passover, on Erev Passover, as the rest of the Jewish world sits down to have a Passover Seder with matzah and maror and stories and questions, the Samaritans follow the biblical practice of offering sacrifices. And so, of course, this gets to some sort of paradox, because on the one hand, when we take something like biking on Yom Kippur, one could argue, it's up to you to depend on how reasonable this argument is, but one can argue that, well, if no Jewish text talks about doing this, how could it be an authentic Jewish practice? On the other hand, on the exact opposite side of the spectrum, a community today, the Samaritans as a case study, that follows the oldest Jewish texts we have to a T and isn't innovating and evolving, their practice is actually seen so non-evolutionary and innovative that it's actually not considered an authentic Jewish practice in 2021. No Jewish community around the world is going to bring a physical Passover lamb offering next week on the eve of Passover. And so with these ideas in mind, this tension in Judaism between tradition and innovation, I want to approach the beginning of the book of Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus. And upon first glance, and something that every Jew, young and old, that is attempting to go through the different parshiot, or the portions of the Torah, will quickly recognize, is that it's actually really hard to connect to the book of Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus. In Genesis, we have these great stories with important morals. In Exodus, we're told the story of freedom. We're given the Torah. We're given some of the fundamental interpersonal laws dealing with the Jewish community. And all of a sudden, we start the book of Vayikra, the portion that we're going to read tomorrow, and it's all about sacrifice. It's which day you should offer which sacrifice, what type of sacrifice, how much of which sacrifice. And these verses can be both alienating and troubling for the modern Jew. How are we supposed to connect to a series of laws dealing with sacrifices in a temple that we haven't had for 2,000 years? So we actually aren't the first generation of Jews to be troubled with these ideas. In the writings of Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, the famous Jewish philosopher, he is equally as confused and as troubled by this idea of animal sacrifices in a centralized temple as being the epitome of Jewish practice. And Maimonides, in his worldview, the way to connect to God, similar to, I would say, a major Jewish view today, is through a synthesis of morals, social action, meditation, philosophy, and ritual. And Maimonides didn't have room in his philosophical worldview of God for a God who desires the aroma of sacrifices, as we're going to read tomorrow. And so this was troubling to Maimonides. So he comes up with a fascinating and beautiful answer. What Maimonides said is, don't think that offering sacrifices in a temple was ever supposed to be the ideal for the Jewish community. Actually, the reason why the Torah commands animal sacrifices, Maimonides continues, is because we have to understand that the Jewish community, upon leaving Egypt and upon attempting to establish themselves as the first monotheistic community in the ancient world, still had influences from the surrounding society. They had just left after generations in Egypt. They were surrounded by all the different nations that were in ancient Israel. And if the Torah and God would have written to the Jewish people, actually the way to serve God is to sit in a room by yourself and meditate on what it means, or to come in a group, much like our community, and sing songs and meditate and tell stories and be in community. Maimonides writes that this would have been completely non-understandable for the ancient Jewish community. And so in order to allow themselves to practice Judaism, God set up a framework that would have been both familiar to where the ancient Jewish community was at, but also faithful to budding Jewish ideas, like the service of one God. And this has fascinating ramifications for how we view the book of Vayikra, how we view the Torah's ubiquity of animal sacrifices. It was never meant to be the ideal. When we study the sacrifices, when we read the book of Vayikra, it allows us to zoom in on a certain cross-section of Jewish practice in history. It allows us to understand and try to tease out the underlying ideas inherent in what it means to sacrifice, rather than the sacrifice itself. The Ramban, Nachmanides, another Jewish Spanish philosopher, says that the word korban actually comes from the root Hebrew word karov. Korban meaning sacrifice, and karov meaning to come close to something else. Korbanot, the Ramban taught, was just a way that the Jewish people were able to connect and come close to God. And in a society, in a generation, and in an age where the Jewish collective and really most of the world at large has outgrown the need to have animal sacrifices, we simply have to choose other things, or we get to choose other things that are going to be our vehicle for service. when we approach the book of Vayikra with its animal sacrifices, let's not view it as an archaic legal code that we're so happy is no longer relevant. Rather, let's approach Vayikra, let's approach Leviticus as a first step in the cycle of a long process of Jewish evolution and innovation, where we take aspects of our world that are familiar to us and we set it aside, raising it up in holiness of our service of God.